Hello, welcome to the Civil War. I am your host, Granite A. Miller, and thank you for being here. This show is a spin-off from our podcast, The Books You Can Sink Your Teeth Into. Civil War is something that I've always been interested for many, many years, and we did a lot of reading about it, and I thought that, hey, why not throw out a podcast and talk about some things, especially since I was just doing it in my book review podcast. So this show's gonna cover different years. The first we're gonna go two sets of 10 years first. So we're gonna start 1830 to 1840, 1840, 1850, 1850 to 1860, and they're really fascinating time frames. So much happened in these build-up years before the secession of the southern states that it's really, really good to learn and to hear. I think you're going to be. I hope you're going to find this interesting, to say the least. What the show we're just going to go through the history, the build-up. We're going to do it as best we can. We're going to follow a couple books. So the next three podcasts, the couple of the books that we're going to be referencing is the Field of Blood book. I'll put the screenshot up here for you. This is an account of the Congress from those same 1830 to 1860. It is fantastic. If you are a history buff, I highly recommend this book to you. It's great. The second book that we're going to be using, especially in this episode, is The Empire of the Summer Moon. So this details something that's not really covered in history classes, which is the Empire of the Comanche Indians. And so we're going to touch on that because they really were a big influencer in how things were shaping up to the Civil War, through the Civil War, and post-Civil War. So, all right, so let's get started. First things that we need to know is back in the years of 1830, 1840, Congress, there were two political parties. Not the Democrats and Republicans. Democrats and the Whigs. And the Whigs were a bit like the modern day Republicans and Democrats. It's like, and these two major parties had both Southern and Northern representation. Now, let's just stick with the Democratic Party. And this holds true for the Whigs as well. But there was quite a bit of a balancing act between the northern states that were free and the southern states which were slave owning. The number of states they pretty much held in balance. So, for example, 9 northern states, 9 southern states, and they kept that pretty good. Of course, Washington, D.C., Virginia, that whole area was all slave owning. And so in the nation's capital, it was a slave owning. But they did abolish, I think in D.C., they said that there was a rule that was passed about, I'll get that. I'll get that to you guys. Sorry, slipped my mind. But back in those days, okay, the West was pretty much like where Houston is today. There was the Louisiana Purchase, right, that we had back in the 1800s, and we had Lewis and Clark sail up the Missouri River, make all those land discoveries, and there was what was called in 1820 the Missouri Compromise, which said that we are going to draw a line across the United States, the 36th parallel, which above it was free and below it was slave, and that's where the new states would be. And this held good for, a good probably 30 years since it was drafted. At the time, Thomas Jefferson was not a big fan. He correctly predicted that the country would fracture along this line. And so and that was back, that was a long time before any of the troubles started leading up to the Civil War. So he correctly predicted that it would be a key point. Well, so yeah, good for him. That was but we have as we look, we have the Northern Democrats, we have Southern Democrats, and they pretty much compromised on things. Now, we could say that, yes, the Northerners were bullied somewhat by their Southern counterparts. I would say yes and no. Northerners didn't really want to deal with slavery. It's like it was there, it was present, it was an institution. They just didn't want to be forced to make a decision, right? Yes or no. Even though it was 1829, Mexico abolished slavery, England abolished slavery, and so the United States was kind of one of the last, was kind of holding on, but there wasn't really any pressure of the northern states at the time to force demands, right? The abolitionists that were up in the north were pretty much on the fringe at this time in the 1830s, kind of considered radicals, right? You could even say terrorists at the time, and so they didn't want to. The northern congressmen, senators didn't want to be associated with them, and so we have this balancing act going on in Congress and in the Senate. Back in the 1830s, we had a huge depression that resulted in 1837. And, cotton really was like the gold standard for the United States. And England was one of our big, big buyers. And what England had to do to help was they raised the interest, and that helped, help the economy somewhat. But because because of this, we had there's a lot of economic pressure that people couldn't buy land, right? And then states and they started demanding for gold because the currency was because of the depression. And another thing to keep in mind, that each state had its own currency pretty much. So if you lived in Vermont, you had Vermont currency. If you lived in Georgia, you had Georgia currency. And so there wasn't really any U.S. bank to say and then people who would travel would have to keep going to, money exchanges and get the local currency wherever they were going. So a lot of this has to do with what we talk about. It kind of sets the stage to where the country was at this time. There were a lot of problems, right, that needed addressed and needed fixed. And at that time, slavery was an issue, but it wasn't one that northern congressmen, senators were going to really push hard to abolish or to make things changed. And so there were a few, congressmen that were. John Quincy Adams was one who wasn't going to sit down and just take a back seat to this. He was, very vocal, and he kept disrupting Congress for answering questions on certain things, which then led to what was called the gag order that was in place. That meant that you couldn't speak about slavery in Congress. They had other ways around it. You could file a petition. It could be sent to an office that could be reviewed, but you couldn't go stand up and start talking about it. So this gag order was in place. Now, at first, it was okay. It actually helped Congress get other things passed, but this was an issue that would grow and become something that would eventually be an issue that had to be dealt with. So that gives us kind of lays the land. Now let's go west, and we talked about this 36 parallel to that point wasn't much to really worry about because Texas was owned by Mexico, right? Mexico owned all that land going up. And there were soldiers that, Spanish, Mexican soldiers that marched it, that patrolled it, that kept Anglos out. But there was another force, another entity that was even more powerful. And those were the Comanche Indians. And this isn't talked about much in the history books. But the Comanche Indians owned Texas, New Mexico, going north up into Kansas, Nebraska. And you ask why? Oh, I've never heard of them. Now, you've all heard probably of the Apaches, right? And so let's just go back a little bit in time. And the Spanish colonizers brought with them horses. And these horses were tended to by the Native Americans, mostly the Pueblo peoples. And when the Pueblos revolted, they opened up the gates and tens of thousands of horses ran free. And the area in the West was ideal for these horses because they were, pretty much mixtures of Arabian and European Spanish horses. And so dry areas, it was perfect landscape for them, just ideal, and they flourished. The Apaches were the first to come and really domesticate the horse and start to ride the horse and use the horse for movements. And they were the scourge then of the plains, right? But the Apaches would dismount when they engaged in warfare and fighting. They would ride their horse up, jump off, and then engage in the fighting. And so while the horse gave them great maneuverability and to come in quickly, get out quickly, it was the Comanches who also started to adapt the horse, but the Comanches learned how to fight on the horse. And if you think about, like in the western side, if you think about the Mongolians and how they leveraged the horses for their attacks, that's what the Comanches did. So riding on the side of the horse, firing arrows underneath the horse's neck as they were using the horse as a shield. I mean, just unheard of, unseen skill of riding that they had, and they soon overwhelmed the Apaches, just overwhelmed them, and started to push the Apaches west into the mountains, as well as other tribes. Now, there's an interesting story where there was a colony that wanted to go up. There was a Spanish mission and fort that was abandoned because of the Apache raids. And then suddenly the Apaches came to the Anglos, to the whites, and said, "Hey, why don't you guys come on up and take this over? We promise not to bother you anymore." And the whites were like, "Wow, how generous! Let's go into this fort." And it was like ideal, right? Perfect land. There's like nobody around. It's like, wow, why Apaches? Why are you doing this for us? Well, later on they realized because the Comanches were raiding, and the Apaches wanted to have a defense there. So, and the Apaches came and just wiped that out. But it just kind of shows you just how, ferocious, but also how powerful the Comanche tribe was. No one could stop them. No one had an answer for them. And that is why the Spanish and the Mexicans never really migrated north, right, in numbers. That is why the French in Louisiana never really migrated all that far west past like Houston area, or Anglos never really got up into that because the Comanches owned it, and they kept the settlers at bay. Now, with that being said, we come up now. We're still in Texas, and we have these white settlers coming in to the south eastern part of the state, which is owned by Mexico, and the Mexicans, of course, would say, "Look, we've abolished slavery. We don't want slaves. You guys are coming in here. You're Quakers or you're some form of Protestantism. We're Catholics, so I want you to be Catholic or at least respect the Catholic monasteries and churches, etc. And we want you to start speaking Spanish." Now, for the Anglos, okay, not too bad, but the slavery was the big deal. And when Mexico started to press, then the whites just kind of stood up and said no, and we get to hold the Alamo, and we get that history, which then ignited the Mexican-American War. The interesting thing about the Mexican-American War is that most of the soldiers there, like the at the time, the lieutenants and the people coming out of West Point, Lees, Grants, Shermans. They Jackson. They all knew each other, right? They all came out of West Point, so they all knew who each other were, and they all fought pretty much in the Mexican-American War, and they all fought together, of course. And so the United States won, and after winning, the Mexico ceded after U.S. paid all that western land from basically the Rio Grande up north. And this is, from what Ulysses S. Grant says, this was the cause of the American Civil War. This is what it really started. It was the Mexican-American War, and that's a very interesting comment that he makes, because we're going to see in our next couple podcasts that indeed it was this land grant that allowed white settlers to come in. Now, there's more land above the 36th parallel than there is below it. What are we going to do, right? We don't want to have too many more northern states that are free. Then power in the South is diminished, etc. So you can start to see a bit of why this was an issue, right? So, but there are other things too that we're going to talk about, and one of them is about the telegraph, the invention of the telegraph and the implementation of it. But we'll save that, for our next show. So we now have, this new land that's here. We have Congress starting to realize, okay, decisions are going to need to be made, and we are, kind of at the point now where we're moving into some real tough questions and answers that are following up. So that hopefully gives you a good outline of 1830s to 1840s. Our next show, we'll talk about 1840s to 1850s. We may even go all the way up to 1860, depend how it goes. Hope you enjoy this. Please like, subscribe, post a comment for me if you want more. We could definitely dive in. There's thing that we didn't talk about was, like, in the early 1830s, we had the panic. That was we had the wheat, the flies that came and destroyed tons of crops. So there was a lot that was going on that kind of drove things the way it did, kind of moved things into this one angle. If you're interested in hearing about that, let me know. I'm also willing to talk a little bit more about the parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, and their differences, and how they maneuvered and whatnot, and what they stood for. So all available. Please post a comment. I think next time we will talk a little bit more, get a little more depth about the Whigs and the Democrats. Until then, thank you all very much. We'll see you next time.